The earth shook violently beneath Willow Warren's feet before she could even scream. One moment, she was inspecting a promising gold vein deep in the mine shaft, and the next, darkness swallowed her whole as tons of rock and timber collapsed around her, burying her alive in the bowels of the Rattlesnake Mine outside Naco, Arizona territory. It was 1883, and the frontier mining town of Naco had been experiencing a modest gold rush that drew prospectors and opportunists from across the country. Among them was 24-year-old Willow Warren, who had inherited her father's claim after his passing. With her chestnut hair often tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat and her practical trousers causing whispers throughout town, Willow was determined to make the mine profitable not just for herself, but for the small crew of men who had loyally worked for her father. On that fateful day in May, Willow had descended into the main shaft to inspect a new vein that her foreman, Hank Billings, had reported might be the motherlode they'd been seeking for months. The old-timers had warned about the instability of the northern section, but the lure of gold had pushed caution aside. When the first tremors started, Hank and the others closer to the entrance managed to escape. But Willow, examining rock nearly 500 feet in, had no chance. The supporting beams cracked like gunshots, and the earth swallowed her before anyone could reach her. Above ground, the dust was still settling when Kade Calloway rode into Naco. At 28, Kade was known throughout the Arizona territory as a man who kept to himself, but could be counted on in times of need. His reputation as both a skilled cowboy and a former cavalry scout had earned him respect, even if his quiet nature kept most at a distance. With sandy brown hair that reached his collar and eyes the color of a summer storm, he cut an impressive figure atop his paint stallion, Diablo. Kade had come to Naco on business, planning to meet with a cattle buyer from Tucson, but the commotion at the edge of town immediately caught his attention. A crowd had gathered near the entrance to the Rattlesnake Mine, with men shouting and women weeping. "What's happened?" Kade asked, dismounting and approaching a soot-covered miner who was gulping water from a ladle. The man looked up, his face ashen beneath the dirt. "Cave in at the Rattlesnake. Most got out, but Miss Warren, she's still down there." Kade's brow furrowed. "The mine owner?" "Yes, sir, Willow Warren." "She was checking a new gold vein when it happened. No telling if she's alive or dead, but with that much rock coming down." The miner's voice trailed off. Kade surveyed the chaotic scene. Men were already organizing themselves, preparing to dig, but there was an air of futility to their movements. He'd seen cave-ins before during his time in Colorado. The chances of finding someone alive after such a collapse were slim to none, yet something compelled him forward. Perhaps it was the desperation in the eyes of the miners, or perhaps it was something else, a strange pulling sensation he couldn't explain. Whatever it was, Kade found himself striding toward the mine entrance, where a burly man with a graying beard appeared to be giving orders. "Hank Billings," the man introduced himself gruffly when Kade approached. "Was Miss Warren's foreman." "Kade Calloway," he responded. "I've dealt with cave-ins before. What's the situation?" Hank's weathered face betrayed a flash of hope. "Northern shaft collapsed." Miss Warren was about 500 feet in, inspecting a new vein. The supports gave way and the whole damn mountain seemed to come down. "Any sounds from inside? Any response?" Hank shook his head. "Nothing yet. We've been calling out, but—" He gestured helplessly. "How stable is the rest of the tunnel?" Kade asked, removing his duster and rolling up his sleeves. "Main shaft seems solid enough for the first 300 feet or so. After that, it's anybody's guess." Kade nodded, his mind already calculating distances, time, and the dwindling odds of finding Willow Warren alive. "We need more men, more shovels and timber for supports, and lanterns everyone you can find. Hank eyed him skeptically. You planning on joining the rescue? Kade met the older man's gaze steadily. I'm planning on leading it. Within the hour, Kade had organized the available men into shifts. Some would dig while others reinforced the tunnel behind them. The work would be slow, dangerous, and quite possibly futile, but nobody voiced those concerns aloud. As Kade prepared to enter the mine, a thin, elderly man approached. His clothes were finer than most in town, marking him as someone of means. Mr. Calloway, the man said. I'm George Pemberton, the banker here in Naco. I understand you're leading this effort. Kade nodded, continuing to check his equipment. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, Pemberton continued, I feel compelled to point out that Miss Warren's chances of survival are exceedingly slim. The expense of this operation, Kade cut him off with a look that had made hardened men step back. Mr. Pemberton, is this your mine? Well, no, but as the primary investor, then with all due respect, sir, your opinion on this matter isn't required. Kade picked up a pickaxe. Every minute we waste talking is a minute Miss Warren doesn't have. Pemberton's face reddened, but before he could respond, Hank stepped between them. George, we're doing this with or without your blessing. Miss Warren wouldn't leave any of us down there, and we're not leaving her. The banker retreated, muttering about fiscal irresponsibility, but Kade had already dismissed him from his mind. His focus now was entirely on the dark mouth of the mine and what or who lay beyond it. Inside the mine, the air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of dynamite from earlier blasting. The main shaft was relatively intact for the first several hundred feet, just as Hank had said, but the going was slow as they carefully tested each step forward. Kade worked tirelessly, setting a pace that the others struggled to match. Every few minutes they would pause, calling Willow's name into the darkness ahead, straining to hear any response. But only silence answered them. As the hours passed, some men began to lose hope. One by one, they would emerge from the mine, shaking their heads and avoiding the questioning gazes of those waiting outside. By nightfall, only Kade, Hank, and 3 others remained committed to the dig. You should rest, Hank told Kade as they paused to drink water and wipe the sweat from their brows. Been at it for 8 hours straight. Kade shook his head. I'm fine. You don't even know her, Hank said quietly. Why push yourself like this? It was a fair question, and one Kade had been asking himself. He had no connection to Willow Warren or the Rattlesnake Mine. He had planned to be in Tucson by now, concluding his business and moving on as he always did. Yet here he was, hundreds of feet underground, fighting against time and nature to save a woman he'd never met. Because she's down there, Kade finally answered, and she deserves the same chance anyone would. Hank studied him for a moment before nodding. Fair enough. They resumed digging, the rhythmic sound of metal against rock their only companion in the oppressive darkness. Meanwhile, trapped beneath layers of rock and shattered timber, Willow Warren drifted in and out of consciousness. The initial collapse had created a small pocket around her, no more than 6 feet long and 3 feet high. A timber beam had fallen at an angle, creating a makeshift shelter that saved her from being crushed outright. She had no idea how much time had passed since the cave-in. Her lantern had been extinguished in the collapse, leaving her in absolute darkness. One of her legs was pinned beneath a heavy rock, and though she didn't think it was broken, she couldn't free herself. Willow had screamed until her voice gave out, then resorted to tapping rhythmically on the rocks around her, hoping the sound would carry. But after what felt like an eternity with no response, despair began to set in. Not like this, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the pitch-black void. Not alone in the dark. Willow thought of her father, who had died peacefully in his sleep just 6 months earlier. She thought of her mother, who had passed when Willow was just a child. And she thought of the life she had built for herself in Naco, not the life most women sought with a husband and children, but a life of independence and purpose. "I'm not ready," she said more firmly, using her free hand to feel around her prison. Her fingers found her canteen, miraculously intact, and she allowed herself a small sip of water. She would need to ration it carefully if there was any hope of survival. As the hours stretched on, Willow forced herself to remain calm, to breathe evenly, and to conserve her energy. She recited poetry she had memorized as a girl, sang softly to herself, and imagined the sun-drenched landscape above her. Anything to keep the crushing weight of the darkness at bay. And then, faintly at first but growing louder, she heard the distant sound of metal striking rock. Someone was digging. "Here," she tried to shout, but her voice was a rasp. Instead, she grabbed a loose rock and began hammering it against the timber beam, creating a steady, rhythmic sound. "I'm here, I'm alive," Kade froze, his pickaxe mid-swing. "Listen," he commanded, and the other men fell silent. There it was, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere ahead of them. "Miss Warren," Kade called out, his voice echoing down the tunnel, "if you can hear us, tap 3 times." The tapping stopped, and for a heart-stopping moment, Kade thought he had imagined it. Then, distinctly, 3 clear taps sounded. A rush of elation swept through the small group. "She's alive," Hank exclaimed, his exhausted face breaking into a smile. "And she can hear us," Kade added, already calculating the distance based on the sound. "We need to adjust our course slightly to the right. That's where she is." With renewed vigor, the men attacked the fallen rock. What had been methodical work now took on an urgency that defied their exhaustion. Kade led the charge, his muscles screaming in protest, but his determination unwavering. By the time the first light of dawn was breaking above ground, they had cleared enough debris to create a small opening into the void where Willow was trapped. Kade held a lantern up to the hole, and for the first time, saw the woman they had been digging toward for nearly 15 hours. Willow squinted against the sudden light, her face smudged with dirt and dried blood from a cut on her forehead. Her brown eyes, however, were alert and focused, showing no signs of the delirium that often accompanied such ordeals. "Miss Warren," Kade said, his voice hoarse from hours of breathing dust and calling out. "My name is Kade Calloway. We're going to get you out of there." Willow looked up at the unfamiliar face framed in the small opening, illuminated by the warm glow of the lantern. The man was clearly exhausted, his features coated in a layer of dust and sweat, but his eyes held a steadiness that instantly reassured her. "My leg," she managed to say, gesturing to where she was pinned. "I can't move it." Kade assessed the situation quickly. The rock pinning her leg was too large to be moved easily, especially in the confined space. They would need to widen the opening considerably before they could free her. "Hank," Kade called over his shoulder, "we need to expand this hole and bring water. She's been down here for almost a day." Hank's weathered face appeared next to Kade's. "Miss Warren, thank the Lord. Hang tight, we're coming for you." Willow nodded, emotion threatening to overcome her as she realized she wasn't going to die in this dark hole. "I knew you'd come," she said, though in truth, there had been moments when hope had abandoned her completely. The men worked to carefully widen the opening, shoring up the unstable areas with timber as they went. When the hole was large enough, Kade slipped through into the pocket where Willow was trapped. The space was cramped, forcing him to crouch beside her. Up close, he could see that, despite her ordeal, there was a determination in her eyes that matched the stories he'd heard about her since arriving in Naco, a woman who ran a mine in a man's world and did it successfully. Water, he said, offering his canteen. Small sips. Willow accepted gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. "Thank you," she whispered. How long have I been down here?" "About 20 hours, Kade answered, already examining the rock pinning her leg. "That rock needs to come off, but I'm worried about causing a further collapse." "How's the pain?" "Manageable," Willow replied, though her clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "I don't think anything's broken. It's just trapped." Kade nodded, admiring her fortitude. "We'll need to brace the ceiling before we try to move this rock. Then I'll lift it just enough for you to pull free. Can you do that?" "Yes," Willow said without hesitation. "Just tell me when." While Hank and the others continued to pass timber and tools through the opening, Kade worked to secure their immediate surroundings. The pocket that had saved Willow's life was precarious at best, and one wrong move could bring the whole thing down on top of them. As he worked, Kade found himself constantly aware of Willow's presence beside him. Despite her circumstances, she remained composed, offering suggestions about the mine structure that proved invaluable. "You know these tunnels well," he commented as he positioned a support beam. Willow's lips curved into a small smile. "I should. I've been working them since I was 18. My father taught me everything he knew." "Your father was the original owner, Willow Warren. He came out here in '75, struck gold in '78, and built the operation from nothing." Pride colored her voice. "When he died last year, there were plenty who thought I'd sell the claim and move back east, as if I'd abandon everything he built, everything we built together." Kade found himself impressed by her determination. Most women in her position would indeed have sold the mine and sought a more conventional life. "It can't be easy, running a mine as a woman." "It's not," Willow acknowledged, "but nothing worth doing ever is." Their eyes met briefly in the dim lantern light, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Both were used to charting their own course, regardless of what others thought. The moment was broken when Hank called down from the opening. "How's it coming, Calloway?" "Almost ready," Kade replied, turning his attention back to the task at hand. "On my count, Miss Warren. 1, 2, 3. With a tremendous effort, Kade lifted the rock just enough for Willow to slide her leg free. She bit back a cry of pain as blood rushed back into her numbed limb, but managed to pull herself clear before Kade had to drop the heavy stone. "Can you move it?" he asked. Kneeling beside her, Willow gingerly flexed her ankle and knee. "Yes, though I don't think I'll be dancing anytime soon." "I'd settle for getting you out of here," Kade said with the ghost of a smile. "Think you can climb through if I help you?" "I'd climb through the gates of hell itself to get out of this hole," Willow replied with unexpected humor. Getting Willow through the narrow opening proved challenging. Her leg, while not broken, was badly bruised and barely supported her weight. Kade had to practically lift her through the hole, his hands firm but gentle around her waist. Once through, the journey back to the surface began. It was slow going, with frequent rest stops to allow Willow to catch her breath. Kade remained by her side the entire time, supporting her when her strength faltered. When they finally emerged from the mine entrance, the late afternoon sun was blinding after so many hours underground. A cheer went up from the crowd that had maintained its vigil, growing as word spread through town that the mine owner had been found alive. Dr. Harris, the town's physician, immediately took charge, ordering Willow to be brought to his office. As they helped her onto a waiting wagon, Willow's hand caught Kade's arm. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice stronger now that she was breathing fresh air. "I don't know how to thank you." Kade shook his head. "No thanks necessary, Miss Warren. I'm just glad we found you in time." "Nevertheless," she insisted, her brown eyes intent on his face, "I owe you my life. I won't forget that." Before Kade could respond, the doctor was urging the wagon forward and Willow was carried away toward town. Kade watched her go, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that had been held at bay by determination and necessity. "You look like you're about to fall over," Hank observed, coming to stand beside him. "Feel like it too," Kade admitted. "Come on," the foreman said, clapping him on the shoulder. "First round at the Silver Dollar is on me. After that, you need about 20 hours of sleep." Kade nodded, though his thoughts were still with the brown-eyed woman whose courage had impressed him more than he cared to admit. He had planned to leave Naco as soon as his business was concluded, but now he found himself wondering if perhaps he might stay a little longer. The Silver Dollar Saloon was crowded when Kade and Hank arrived, the rescue at the rattlesnake mine being the main topic of conversation. When they entered, a hush fell over the room before erupting into applause and cheers. Men Kade had never met were slapping him on the back, pressing drinks into his hands and calling him a hero. Unused to such attention, Kade retreated to a corner table with Hank, who seemed to understand his discomfort. "Folks around here are protective of Miss Warren," Hank explained as they sipped their whiskey. "Her father was well-liked, and she's proven herself just as worthy of respect. Running that mine ain't easy, especially for a woman, but she's got a head for business and isn't afraid of hard work." "She mentioned she's been working the mine since she was 18, Kade said. Hank nodded. "Her mother died when she was young, and her father raised her more like a son than a daughter. Taught her mining geology, how to ride, shoot, and drive a hard bargain. Scandalized the local ladies, but Elijah didn't care, and neither does Willow." "No husband?" Kade asked, then immediately regretted the question, which seemed more personal than he'd intended. If Hank noticed anything in Kade's tone, he didn't comment on it. "There have been suitors, but Miss Warren's made it clear the mine comes first. Most men can't stomach the idea of a wife who spends her days underground and knows more about gold veins than dinner parties." Kade found himself thinking that such a woman sounded far more interesting than the conventional sort, but kept the thought to himself. "What about you, Calloway?" Hank asked, changing the subject. "What brings you to Naco? Just passing through." "Business," Kade replied. "I'm meeting with a cattle buyer from Tucson tomorrow today, I suppose about a herd I've got coming up from Mexico." "You're a rancher." "Among other things," Kade said vaguely. The truth was more complicated. After his time with the cavalry, he'd worked as a scout, a ranch hand, and occasionally as hired security for cattle drives. The small herd he was bringing up from Mexico represented his first attempt at establishing himself as something more permanent, though he hadn't yet decided where he would settle. "Well, after what you did today, you'll find plenty of doors open to you in Naco," Hank said, raising his glass in a toast. "To finding Miss Warren alive." "To finding her alive," Kade echoed, though privately he thought it was Willow's own tenacity that had kept her breathing until they reached her. After finishing his drink, Kade excused himself. The events of the past day were catching up to him rapidly, and all he wanted now was a bed. He had a room reserved at the Arizona House Hotel, and he made his way there on legs that felt increasingly unsteady. Sleep claimed him the moment his head hit the pillow, and he didn't stir until late the following afternoon. When he finally awoke, his muscles protesting every movement, he was momentarily disoriented, the events at the mine seeming almost dreamlike. After washing and changing into clean clothes, Kade headed downstairs to find food and determine if the cattle buyer from Tucson had arrived as planned. The hotel dining room was quiet at that hour, but the proprietor's wife insisted on serving him a hearty meal on the house, despite his protests. "Mr. Calloway," a voice interrupted as he was finishing his coffee. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Looking up, Kade was surprised to see George Pemberton, the banker who had questioned the rescue effort. The man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Mr. Pemberton," Kade acknowledged neutrally. "What can I do for you?" The banker cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize for my comments yesterday. It was unconscionable of me to suggest abandoning Miss Warren, and I'm grateful that you ignored my short-sightedness." Kade studied the man, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Relief washed over Pemberton's face. "Thank you. Miss Warren is a valued client of my bank, and I assure you, my concern yesterday was purely financial, not personal. I've already visited her at Dr. Harris's to express my sincere regret." "How is she?" Kade asked, the question escaping before he could consider it. "Remarkably well, all things considered," Pemberton replied. "Dr. Harris says no bones were broken, though she's badly bruised and suffering from the ordeal. He's keeping her under observation for another day, but she's already talking about returning to the mine." He shook his head in disbelief. "The woman has more grit than most men I know." Kade nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. "The mine will need a thorough inspection before anyone goes back in. That northern section is dangerously unstable." "Yes. Well, perhaps you could mention that to Miss Warren when you see her." At Kade's questioning look, Pemberton added, "She's asked to see you." "That's actually why I sought you out. Dr. Harris's office is just down the street, across from the general store." Kade hesitated, though he couldn't quite explain why. Part of him had been wondering how Willow was faring, but he hadn't planned to seek her out. Their paths had crossed by chance, and now that she was safe, there was no reason for further interaction. Yet he found himself nodding. "I'll stop by before I meet with the cattle buyer." Pemberton looked relieved. "Excellent. And again, Mr. Calloway, thank you for what you did. The entire town is in your debt." After the banker departed, Kade finished his coffee slowly, gathering his thoughts. He told himself he was merely being courteous by agreeing to visit Willow. After all, she had asked to see him, probably to formally thank him for his role in the rescue. It would be rude to refuse. But as he made his way toward the doctor's office, Kade admitted to himself that courtesy had little to do with his decision. There was something about Willow Warren that intrigued him: her courage in that collapsed mine, her determination to forge her own path in a world that didn't make it easy for women to do so. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and he found himself wanting to know more about her. Such curiosity was unusual for Kade. He had spent the years since leaving the cavalry keeping most people at arm's length, focusing on work rather than connections. The loss of his family in a Comanche raid when he was just 16 had left scars that had never fully healed, making him wary of forming attachments that could lead to more pain. Dr. Harris's office was a neat, whitewashed building with a small sign hanging above the door. Kade removed his hat as he entered, finding himself in a tidy waiting area. A middle-aged woman looked up from a desk. "Mr. Calloway," she greeted him with a warm smile. "I'm Mrs. Harris. The doctor said you might come by. Miss Warren is just through there." She gestured to a door on the right. "She's been asking about you all morning." Kade nodded his thanks and approached the indicated door. He knocked lightly before entering. The room beyond was small but bright, with sunlight streaming through a large window. Willow was seated in a chair rather than lying in the bed, dressed in a simple blue dress rather than her mining clothes. With her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders and her face clean of the mine's grime, she looked younger and more vulnerable than she had in the depths of the rattlesnake. But the impression of vulnerability vanished the moment she looked up. Her brown eyes were clear and sharp, and the set of her jaw spoke of the same determination he had witnessed underground. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her face lighting up with a smile that transformed her features from merely pretty to striking. "I was beginning to think you'd left town without giving me the chance to thank you properly." "Miss Warren," he replied, moving further into the room, "how are you feeling?" "Better than I have any right to," she answered honestly. "Dr. Harris says it's a miracle I escaped with only bruises and a few cuts. Please sit down." She gestured to a chair opposite her own. Kade sat, placing his hat on his knee. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes and the faint bruising on her temple, reminders of her ordeal. "You were lucky," he said. "Most cave-ins don't end so well." "It wasn't just luck," Willow countered, her gaze direct. "It was your determination. Hank told me you worked for 48 hours straight to reach me." "We all did," Kade said, uncomfortable with the praise. "But it was you who organized the rescue, who refused to give up even when others thought it was hopeless." Her voice softened. "Hank also told me that you're not even from Naco, that you were just passing through on business." Kade shifted slightly in his chair. "Right place, right time, I suppose." Willow studied him for a moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Most men would have continued on their way, especially with no connection to me or the mine. Why did you stay?" It was a direct question, and Kade found himself searching for an answer that made sense, even to himself. "I've been in cave-ins before," he finally said. "In Colorado. I've seen what happens when rescue efforts are disorganized or abandoned too quickly. So it was experience, not some noble impulse." Willow's tone was gently teasing. "Maybe a bit of both," Kade admitted, surprising himself with his candor. Willow's smile deepened. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm grateful. The rattlesnake is more than just a mine to me. It's my father's legacy and mine." "Hank mentioned your father taught you the business." "Everything he knew," Willow confirmed. "My mother died when I was 8, and after that it was just the two of us. He used to say that since God hadn't seen fit to give him a son, he'd make sure his daughter could handle whatever life threw at her." "He seems to have succeeded," Kade observed. Willow laughed, a warm sound that filled the small room. "He would be pleased to hear you say so. Though I'm sure he never imagined whatever life threw at her would include being buried alive in her own mine." Despite the gravity of the subject, Kade found himself smiling. Willow Warren had an unexpected humor about her, a lightness that belied her ordeal. "What will you do now?" "About the mine," her expression grew more serious. "Rebuild, of course. The northern shaft is lost, but the main vein runs through the eastern section, which should still be accessible. Once the engineers determine it's safe, we'll resume operations." "That could take weeks," Kade pointed out. "And the cost of clearing and reinforcing after a collapse like that will be considerable," Willow finished for him. "I'm aware. But the rattlesnake is profitable, Mr. Calloway. We hit a rich vein last winter that's been producing steadily. There's more than enough capital to fund the repairs." Kade nodded, impressed again by her business acumen. Most mine owners he had encountered were gamblers at heart, betting everything on the next big strike. Willow seemed more pragmatic. "Mr. Calloway," she said after a brief silence, "I've kept you long enough, and I'm sure you have business to attend to. But before you go, there's something I'd like to offer you." "You don't owe me anything, Miss Warren." "It's not about owing," she said firmly. "It's about recognizing value. Hank tells me you're bringing a herd up from Mexico and looking for grazing land. The rattlesnake owns 500 acres south of town, good grassland with reliable water. It's more than we need for the mine operations. I'd like to offer you a lease on 200 acres at a favorable rate." Kade was taken aback. The offer was unexpected and generous, the kind of opportunity that didn't come along often for a man trying to establish himself. "That's Very kind, but it's not kindness, Willow interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact. It's good business. That land has been sitting unused since my father bought it as a buffer for the mine. You'd be doing me a favor by making it productive, and Naco could use more enterprising men like you. Kade considered her words. He had been planning to drive the herd further north, perhaps all the way to Colorado where he had contacts. But the idea of staying in Naco, of having a base of operations that could eventually grow into something more permanent, was appealing in ways he hadn't anticipated. And if he was honest with himself, part of that appeal was sitting across from him, her brown eyes watching him with intelligent interest. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Willow nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "That's all I ask. The offer stands whenever you're ready to discuss terms." Kade rose to leave, but paused at the door. "Miss Warren," he said, turning back to her, "I'm glad you're all right." Her smile was softer now, more genuine than the business-like expression she had worn while discussing the land lease. "So am I, Mr. Calloway, and I have you to thank for that." As Kade left the doctor's office, he found himself at a crossroads, both literally in the dusty street of Naco and figuratively in his life. The meeting with the cattle buyer from Tucson awaited him, after which his original plan had been to continue north. But Willow's offer presented a compelling alternative. For the first time in years, Kade felt the pull to stay somewhere, to perhaps put down roots. The sensation was as unfamiliar as it was unsettling. Pushing these thoughts aside for the moment, he headed toward the hotel where he was to meet the cattle buyer. Business first, decisions later. The meeting with Harold Simmons, the cattle buyer from Tucson, went smoothly. The man was impressed with Kade's reputation and agreed to purchase the entire herd at a fair price, with payment to be made upon delivery. "You planning to drive them all the way to Tucson?" Simmons asked as they concluded their business. "That was the original plan," Kade admitted. "But I'm considering other options now." Simmons nodded thoughtfully. "Heard you're something of a local hero after that mine rescue. Must open some doors for you around here." Kade didn't respond directly to this, uncomfortable with the hero label that seemed to have attached itself to him. "I've been offered some grazing land south of town. Might be worth looking into." "Warren land, I'd wager," Simmons said shrewdly. "That girl's got a head for business, just like her old man. If she's offering you a deal, I'd take it. The soil in these parts is richer than most realize. Good cattle country, if you can secure the water rights." The conversation gave Kade more to consider. By the time they parted ways, with Simmons headed back to Tucson, and Kade promised to deliver the herd within 3 weeks, he was leaning strongly toward accepting Willow's offer. The next morning, Kade rode out to inspect the land Willow had mentioned. It was indeed good grazing territory, gently rolling hills covered in native grasses, with a small creek running through the eastern portion. The water was clear and fast-flowing, fed by mountain springs rather than dependent on the unreliable desert rains. As he surveyed the property, Kade could envision building a small ranch here. Nothing elaborate, but solid, a place to call his own after years of drifting. The thought was both appealing and terrifying. Lost in these contemplations, he almost didn't notice the rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew nearer, he was surprised to recognize Willow, sitting tall in her saddle despite her recent ordeal. "Miss Warren," he called as she came within earshot. "Should you be riding so soon?" Willow guided her horse, a handsome bay mare, to a stop beside him. She was dressed in practical riding clothes, a split skirt that allowed her to ride astride, a cotton blouse, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face from the Arizona sun. Dr. Harris advised against it. she admitted with a smile that suggested she often ignored medical advice. "But I saw you riding out this morning and thought you might want a proper tour of the property." "You're supposed to be resting," Kade pointed out, though he couldn't help but admire her resilience. "I've been resting for 3 days," Willow replied dismissively. "Besides, there's work to be done. The engineers are at the mine today, assessing the damage and determining what can be salvaged." Kade frowned. "And you thought a horseback ride was more important?" "I thought getting you settled in Naco was a priority," she countered smoothly. "The engineers don't need me hovering over them, but you need to understand what you're potentially leasing. Unless you've already decided against my offer." "I'm considering it," Kade said honestly. "The land is good, better than I expected." "It gets better," Willow said, guiding her horse forward. "Come on, I'll show you the rest." For the next hour, they rode the property together, with Willow pointing out its features, the best grazing areas, the places where the creek ran deepest, the natural shelter provided by a stand of cottonwoods in one corner. Her knowledge of the land was impressive, and Kade found himself relaxing in her company. "My father bought this parcel in '79, she explained as they paused to let their horses drink from the creek. "He always said land was the one thing they weren't making any more of. The mine was our primary focus, but he believed in diversification." "Smart man," Kade commented. "He was," Willow agreed, a hint of sadness coloring her voice. "He would have liked you, I think. He valued competence above all else." "High praise," Kade said, finding himself oddly pleased by the idea that Elijah Warren might have approved of him. They continued their ride, eventually stopping on a small rise that offered a view of Naco in the distance. The town looked almost picturesque from this vantage point, the harsh realities of frontier life softened by distance. "Have you decided about the lease?" Willow asked directly as they sat side by side on their horses. Kade turned to look at her, struck again by her forthrightness. Most people would have approached the subject more obliquely. "Yes," he said, "I'd like to accept your offer." Willow's face brightened. "Excellent. We can draw up the papers tomorrow. I think you'll find the terms more than fair." "I have no doubt," Kade said. "But there's something I should mention first. The herd I'm bringing up is modest 50 head to start. This is more land than I need right now." "Room to grow," Willow said practically. "And in the meantime, you can sublease what you don't use to other ranchers." "There's always demand for good grazing land," Kade nodded, impressed again by her business sense. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Willow admitted, her expression turning more serious. "The mine will need significant investment to reopen. The engineer's preliminary report suggests the damage is more extensive than we initially hoped." "Is that going to be a problem?" Kade asked, sensing there was more to her statement. Willow sighed, looking out over the landscape rather than at him. "Financially, no. As I told you, we have capital reserves, but there's growing pressure from some quarters to sell rather than rebuild." "Pemberton," Kade guessed, remembering the banker's initial reluctance to fund the rescue. "Among others," Willow confirmed. "There's a mining company out of San Francisco that's been trying to buy up smaller operations throughout the territory. They made an offer 6 months ago that my father rejected. Now they're back, smelling blood in the water after the cave-in. And they're leveraging Pemberton to pressure you," Kade said, understanding the dynamics at play. "It was a common enough tactic in the West outside interests, using local financial institutions to gain control of valuable properties." "Exactly." Willow turned back to him, her expression resolute. "I won't sell. The rattlesnake isn't just a business to me, it's my home, my heritage. But I need allies in Naco, people with a stake in the community's future rather than just quick profits." "People like me," Kade said, seeing now another dimension to her generous land offer. Willow had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Is it that transparent?" "Yes, having a new business owner in town, especially one who's already well regarded, would strengthen my position. But that doesn't change the fact that it's a good deal for you too." Kade wasn't offended by her admission. In fact, he respected her honesty. "I've dealt with corporate mining interests before in Colorado. They tend to leave devastation in their wake, both environmental and economic." "Then you understand what's at stake," Willow said earnestly. "I run a clean operation. My men are paid fair wages. We take safety seriously, the cave and notwithstanding, and profits stay in the community rather than flowing to San Francisco or New York." "You don't need to convince me, Miss Warren," Kade said quietly. "I've already agreed to the lease." Relief washed over Willow's face. "Thank you, and please, after all we've been through, I think you can call me Willow." "Willow," Kade repeated, finding he liked the way her name felt. "Then I'm Kade to you." She smiled, extending her hand to him as if to seal their agreement. When he took it, he was struck by the contrast. Her hand was smaller than his, but the calluses spoke of a woman who wasn't afraid of hard work. "To new beginnings, Kade," she said. "To new beginnings," he echoed, finding himself more invested in the idea than he had been in years. As they rode back toward town, a comfortable silence settled between them. Kade found himself stealing glances at Willow, admiring the way she sat her horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. There was something refreshing about her lack of pretense, her direct manner that dispensed with the usual social niceties without ever becoming impolite. For her part, Willow was aware of Kade's occasional glances, but didn't comment on them. There was something about the quiet cowboy that intrigued her, a depth beneath his reserved exterior that she found herself wanting to explore. It wasn't just gratitude for the rescue, though that was certainly part of it. It was the sense that in Kade Calloway, she had found someone who might truly understand her world and her place in it. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity for both Kade and Willow. Kade rode south to meet his men and the cattle herd at the border, while Willow threw herself into the mine restoration efforts with characteristic determination. When Kade returned to Naco, driving 50 head of sleek Mexican cattle before him, Willow was waiting at the edge of town. She watched as he and his 3 hired hands guided the animals toward the newly leased pastureland, admiring the efficiency with which they worked. That evening, Willow invited Kade to dinner at her home, a modest but well-built house near the mine that her father had constructed when they first came to Naco. It was the first time they had been truly alone together, without the pretext of business or the presence of others. "Your home is lovely," Kade commented as Willow showed him into the comfortable parlor. The house reflected its owner, practical but with unexpected touches of elegance, like the bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes and the small piano in one corner. "Thank you," Willow said. "It's been home since I was 16. Before that, we lived in a tent while my father built it." She smiled at the memory. "I learned to lay brick that summer." "Is there anything you can't do?" Kade asked, only half joking. Willow laughed. "Plenty. I'm a terrible cook, for one thing, which is why Mrs. Figueroa prepares most of our meals." She gestured toward the kitchen, where an older Mexican woman could be glimpsed stirring something that smelled delicious. "And I never mastered the piano, despite my father's insistence on lessons." "My mother played," Kade said, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "Not well, but enthusiastically. My father used to say she made up in volume what she lacked in skill." It was the first time he had mentioned his parents to Willow, and she noted the past tense with a gentle question in her eyes. "You lost them," Kade nodded, moving to examine a painting on the wall rather than meeting her gaze directly. Comanche raid when I was 16. Our farm was in the Texas Hill Country near the frontier. Willow's expression softened with genuine sympathy, but without the pity that Kade had come to dread in such moments. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "It's a hard thing losing family." "It was a long time ago," Kade replied, though they both knew that time didn't erase such wounds, it merely made them easier to bear. "Is that why you became a cavalry scout?" Willow asked, remembering what Hank had told her about Cade's background. "Partly," Kade admitted. "It seemed important at the time, helping to protect others from what happened to my family. But the reality of it was complicated." Willow nodded in understanding. The relations between settlers and Native Americans were indeed complex, with atrocities on both sides and innocent victims caught in the middle. It wasn't a subject that lent itself to simple conversations over dinner. "Well," she said, deliberately lightening the mood, "I'm glad whatever path you took led you to Naco just when I needed someone to dig me out of a hole, quite literally." Kade smiled at that, grateful for her tact. "As I recall, you were doing a pretty good job of keeping yourself alive down there." "Most people would have panicked." "Oh, I panicked," Willow assured him, her tone wry, "for about the first hour. Then I realized that panic wasn't particularly helpful, so I tried something else." "Like what?" Kade asked, genuinely curious about how she had endured those long, dark hours trapped underground. "I recited poetry," Willow admitted with a small laugh. "All the verses I could remember from school. Then I sang every song I knew. When I ran out of those, I started planning the mine expansion I've been considering for the eastern shaft. By the time I heard you digging, I had mapped out the entire project in my head." Kade shook his head in amazement. "Most men I've known wouldn't have managed half so well." "Most men haven't spent their lives proving they belong in places others think they don't," Willow said simply. Before Kade could respond to this insight, Mrs. Figueroa announced that dinner was served. The meal was excellent tender beef stew with fresh biscuits, followed by apple pie that Willow confessed had been purchased from the baker in town, rather than made at home. Their conversation over dinner flowed easily, covering topics from the progress on the mine repairs to Cade's plans for his cattle operation. Willow was as knowledgeable about ranching as she was about mining, having grown up in a territory where the two industries often intersected. "I've been thinking about your situation with Pemberton and the San Francisco mining interests," Kade said as they lingered over coffee after the meal. "Have they made another formal offer?" Willow nodded. "Yesterday. Double what they offered my father, with the argument that the cave-in has devalued the operation." "And your response?" "The same as my father's," Willow said firmly. "The rattlesnake isn't for sale at any price." Kade studied her across the table. In the soft lamplight, with her chestnut hair loosely pinned up and color in her cheeks from the wine they had shared with dinner, she looked both formidable and vulnerable, a contradiction that he found increasingly compelling. "What if you had a partner?" he suggested suddenly. "Not the San Francisco company, but a local investor, someone with an interest in keeping the mine operating as it is now." Willow's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Are you offering to invest in the rattlesnake, Kade?" "I might be," he said, surprising himself almost as much as her. "The cattle operation is a start, but diversification, as your father said, is wise. And I have some experience with mining operations from my time in Colorado." Willow considered his words carefully. "It's a generous offer, but I need to be clear I maintain controlling interest. The rattlesnake stays a Warren operation." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Kade assured her. "Think of it as insurance against Pemberton's pressure tactics. With another investor involved, especially one with ties to the cattle industry, the mine becomes part of a larger local economic picture. Makes it harder for outside interests to isolate and target you. Willow's expression was thoughtful as she weighed his proposal. How much were you considering investing? Enough to make it clear I have a stake in the outcome, Kade said. We can discuss specifics once I've reviewed the mine's financial statements, assuming you're open to the idea. For a moment, Willow was silent, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Then she looked up at him, her brown eyes direct. Why would you do this, Kade? You barely know me or Naco. A month ago, you'd never even heard of the rattlesnake mine. It was a fair question, and one Kade had been asking himself since the idea formed in his mind. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure of his own motivations. Part of it was business. The mine, despite the recent setback, was clearly profitable. Part of it was his instinctive dislike of corporate interests that sought to swallow smaller operations. But there was something else too, something that had more to do with the woman sitting across from him than with business considerations or economic principles. Let's just say I've spent too many years moving on, Kade finally answered. Maybe it's time to build something that lasts. Willow held his gaze for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. All right, we'll discuss it further once you've had a chance to review the financials. No commitments yet from either side. Agreed, Kade said, relieved that she hadn't dismissed the idea outright. As the evening drew to a close, Kade found himself reluctant to leave. There was an ease to being in Willow's company that he had rarely experienced with anyone, man or woman. She walked him to the door, where they paused awkwardly, suddenly conscious of the shift in their relationship from rescuer and rescued to potential business partners and whatever else might be developing between them. Thank you for dinner, Kade said formally, taking his hat from the hook by the door. Thank you for coming, Willow replied, equally formal. Then, more softly, and thank you for considering an investment in the rattlesnake. Whatever you decide, I appreciate that you care enough to offer. Kade nodded, acutely aware of her standing close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. For a wild moment, he considered taking her hand, or even bending to kiss her cheek. But the moment passed, and he settled for a tip of his hat as he stepped outside. Good night, Willow, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Good night, Kade, she answered, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if she knew exactly what he had been thinking. As Kade walked back to town under a canopy of desert stars, he reflected on how quickly and unexpectedly his life had changed since arriving in Naco. What had begun as a simple business trip had transformed into something far more complex and potentially rewarding. For the first time since losing his family, Kade found himself thinking about the future not as an abstract concept, but as something tangible and inviting. A future that, against all odds, might include a headstrong mine owner with courage to match her determination. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Over the next several weeks, Kade and Willow settled into a routine that balanced their separate business interests with their growing personal connection. Kade established his cattle operation on the leased land, building a small but sturdy cabin and corrals with the help of his hired hands. Willow continued to oversee the mine restoration, which was progressing steadily despite occasional setbacks. After reviewing the rattlesnake's financial records, Kade confirmed his interest in investing. The terms they negotiated were favorable to both parties. Willow maintained controlling interest, as she had insisted, while Kade gained enough of a stake to give him a legitimate voice in major decisions. The partnership made economic sense, but neither Kade nor Willow was under any illusion that business was the only thing drawing them together. They began spending more time in each other's company, sharing meals, riding the range together, and learning each other's stories. Kade told Willow about his years with the cavalry, about the disillusionment that had eventually led him to leave, and about his subsequent wandering. Willow shared memories of her father, of learning to be a woman in a man's world, and of her dreams for the rattlesnake's future. The people of Naco watched this developing relationship with varying degrees of interest and approval. Most were pleased to see Willow finding happiness after her father's death and her own near tragedy in the mine. A few, particularly those with business connections to the San Francisco mining interests, were less enthusiastic about the alliance forming between the town's mine owner and the newcomer. George Pemberton, caught between his banking responsibilities to outside investors and his genuine regard for Willow, maintained a cautious neutrality. But it was clear that Kade's investment in the mine had weakened the banker's leverage, much to the frustration of his contacts in San Francisco. Summer gave way to fall, and as the desert heat moderated, work on both the mine and the ranch intensified. The rattlesnake was nearly ready to resume operations, and Kade's cattle herd had grown with the addition of 20 head purchased from a rancher north of Tucson. On a crisp October evening, Kade rode to Willow's house for their now regular Friday dinner. He had spent the day working with his men to repair fencing on the eastern boundary of his leased land, and though he was tired, he had looked forward to seeing Willow all day. Something had changed between them in recent weeks, a subtle shift from friendship and business partnership toward something deeper. Neither had put it into words yet, but Kade knew the time for that was coming soon. As he approached Willow's house, he was surprised to see several horses tied up outside, including George Pemberton's recognizable gray gelding. Kade hesitated, wondering if he should turn back and return another time, but before he could decide, the front door opened and Willow stepped out onto the porch. "Kade," she called, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. "I'm glad you're here. We have a situation." Dismounting quickly, Kade secured his horse and joined Willow on the porch. "What's happened?" he asked, noting the tension in her posture. "The San Francisco Mining Company has made another move," Willow explained in a low voice. "They've filed a claim challenging our right to the eastern section of the mine, the part we're about to reopen. Pemberton brought the papers this evening." Kade frowned. "On what grounds could they possibly challenge your claim? The rattlesnake has been operating legally for years." "They're claiming that my father's original filing had a surveying error that invalidates our ownership of that specific section," Willow said, her anger evident beneath her controlled tone. "It's nonsense, of course, but it could tie us up in territorial court for months, delaying the reopening indefinitely. And bleeding your finances in legal fees," Kade added, seeing the strategy for what it was. "Who else is inside? Pemberton, obviously. And James Hargrove, he's an attorney from Tucson who's handled our legal matters since my father's time. He happened to be in town when Pemberton received the filing." Kade nodded, his mind already working through the implications. "Let's hear what they have to say." Inside, the atmosphere was tense. George Pemberton sat stiffly in one of Willow's parlor chairs, while an older man with spectacles, presumably Hargrove, was examining a stack of papers spread out on a small table. "Mr. Calloway," Pemberton acknowledged with a nod. "I assume Miss Warren has informed you of the development." "She has," Kade replied coolly. "I'd like to see these alleged survey errors for myself." Hargrove looked up, assessing Kade with intelligent eyes. "You have some legal training, Mr. Calloway." "No," Kade admitted. but I've seen similar tactics used against small operators in Colorado. Corporate interests find a technicality, file a challenge, and then offer to settle by purchasing the claim at a reduced price. Precisely, Hargrove agreed, seeming pleased by Kade's understanding. And that is exactly what the San Francisco Mining Company is attempting here. The supposed survey error is tenuous at best, but fighting it in court would be costly and time-consuming for Miss Warren. And conveniently, they've timed this just as we're about to reopen, Willow added, pacing the room with barely contained fury. Every day the mine remains closed is costing us money and putting my men out of work. Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. I want to be clear that the bank had no prior knowledge of this filing. I received it only this morning with instructions to deliver it to Miss Warren. But you're not surprised by it, Kade observed, studying the banker's expression. I had heard rumors that the company was exploring legal options, Pemberton admitted reluctantly. But I had no specific information until today. And now what? Willow demanded. Am I supposed to sell to them at half what the mine is worth just to avoid a legal battle? That appears to be their hope, Hargrove said dryly. However, I believe we have options. The survey they're challenging was conducted by the Territorial Land Office and should have significant legal standing. Additionally, your father's continuous, unchallenged operation of the mine for over 5 years establishes precedent. How long would a court fight take? Kade asked, moving to stand beside Willow in what he hoped was a show of solidarity. Months at minimum, Hargrove admitted. Possibly a year or more if they employ delaying tactics, which I expect they will. Willow's face paled at this assessment, though her voice remained steady. The mine can't stay closed that long. My men have families to feed. There is another possibility, Pemberton interjected carefully. I've been authorized to offer an immediate purchase of the entire operation, not at a reduced price, but at the full value offered before the cave-in. It would resolve the legal challenge instantly and provide Miss Warren with a substantial sum. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Willow. For a moment, she didn't speak, and Kade could see the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. Then she straightened, her jaw set in the determined expression he had come to know well. My answer remains the same, Mr. Pemberton, she said firmly. The rattlesnake is not for sale, not to the San Francisco Mining Company, not to anyone. Pemberton sighed, looking genuinely regretful. I expected as much, but I was obligated to present the offer. For what it's worth, I admire your resolve, Miss Warren. We'll fight this in court if necessary, Hargrove assured Willow. It may take time, but I believe we can prevail. And in the meantime, Willow asked, what about my men? What about the commitments we've made to ore buyers? A tense silence followed her questions, broken only when Kade spoke up. We continue operations in the western section, he said decisively. The challenge only affects the eastern shaft, correct? The western vein is smaller, but it's still viable. We adjust our contracts, reduce expectations, and keep as many men employed as possible while we fight this. Willow turned to him, hope flickering in her eyes. The western section was nearly played out when we shifted focus east. The yields would be significantly lower. But it would keep the mine running, Kade pointed out, and show the San Francisco company that their tactics won't shut us down completely. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. It's a sound approach. And continuing operations would strengthen our case that the mine has been consistently worked under the Warren claim. It would require additional investment, Willow said, her practical mind already calculating costs. The western section would need new supports, possibly additional blasting to reach deeper veins. I'll increase my investment, Kade said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes to keep the rattlesnake operating while we fight this." Willow stared at him, clearly moved by his commitment. "Kade, I can't ask you to take on that risk." "You're not asking," he replied simply. "I'm offering. We're partners now, remember? Your fight is my fight." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding deeper than words could express. Pemberton and Hargrove exchanged glances, sensing the shift in the room's emotional temperature. "Well," Hargrove said, breaking the moment, "it seems we have a preliminary strategy. I'll begin preparing our legal response immediately. In the meantime, Miss Warren, if you and Mr. Calloway could provide me with all documentation related to the original survey and subsequent operations, it would be most helpful." The discussion continued for another hour, with plans being made and responsibilities assigned. When Pemberton and Hargrove finally departed, promising to return the next day with additional information, Willow closed the door behind them and leaned against it, suddenly looking exhausted. "I'm sorry about dinner," she said with a weak attempt at a smile. "I'm afraid Mrs. Figueroa's stew has gone cold by now." "I'm not concerned about dinner," Kade said, moving to stand before her. "Are you all right?" Willow pushed away from the door, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "No, I'm furious. The San Francisco company thinks they can bully me because I'm a woman, because they have more money, more lawyers. They expect me to give up what my father built, what I've fought to maintain." "They've underestimated you," Kade said with absolute conviction, "and that's their mistake." Willow looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce despite her fatigue. "They've underestimated us both, it seems. You didn't have to offer additional investment, Kade. This isn't your battle." "Isn't it?" Kade asked softly, taking a step closer to her. "Haven't I made it clear by now that your concerns are my concerns? That what matters to you matters to me?" Willow's breath caught as she registered his proximity and the intensity in his gray eyes. "You've been a good friend and partner," she said carefully. "Is that all I am to you, Willow?" "A friend and business partner," Kade asked, his voice low and serious for a moment. She didn't answer, and Kade feared he had misread the signals that had been passing between them for weeks. Then, with characteristic directness, Willow closed the remaining distance between them. "No," she said simply. "That's not all you are to me, not for some time now." Relief and something far more powerful washed over Kade. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. "I'm glad to hear it," he murmured. "Because you've become much more than a business partner to me, too." Willow leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "This complicates things," she pointed out, practical even in this moment. "Life is complicated," Kade replied with a small smile. "But some things are worth the complications." And then, because words seemed inadequate for what he was feeling, Kade bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. But when Willow's arms slid around his neck, pulling him closer, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise, and a future neither had dared to imagine until now. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Willow rested her forehead against Kade's chest. "Well," she said with a soft laugh, "that's one way to take my mind off legal troubles." Kade smiled, his arm still around her waist. "Happy to be of service, madam." Willow looked up at him, her expression turning serious again. "We're really going to fight this, aren't we? The San Francisco company, the court challenge, all of it." "Every step of the way," Kade assured her. "Together." And in that moment, standing in the warm lamplight of Willow's parlor, the path ahead seemed clear despite the obstacles. They would reopen the western section of the mine, maintain operations as best they could, and fight the legal battle for as long as necessary. But more than that, they would face whatever came next side by side, their separate journeys now irrevocably intertwined. The fight to save the rattlesnake mine proved even more challenging than anticipated. Over the next 6 months, Willow and Kade poured their energies into reopening the western section, while simultaneously battling the San Francisco Mining Company's legal challenge. The western vein yielded less ore than they had hoped, forcing them to reduce their workforce and scale back operations. But with Kade's additional investment and Willow's determined management, they managed to keep the mine running, albeit at a diminished capacity. The legal proceedings dragged on, with Hargrove filing motions and counter-motions in the territorial court. The San Francisco Company, as expected, employed every delaying tactic available, hoping to drain the rattlesnake's resources and force a sale. Through it all, Kade and Willow's relationship deepened. What had begun in the desperate hours of a mine rescue had evolved into a partnership in every sense of the word. They faced each setback together, celebrated small victories, and found in each other the support and understanding they both had lacked for so long. By spring of 1884, nearly a year after the cave-in that had first brought them together, a resolution to the legal battle finally appeared on the horizon. Hargrove arrived in Naco with news that the territorial judge was prepared to rule on the survey dispute. Willow and Kade rode to Tucson together for the hearing, both acutely aware that the future of the rattlesnake and, by extension, their life in Naco hung in the balance. The courthouse was crowded when they arrived. The San Francisco Mining Company had sent a team of lawyers and executives, all dressed in expensive Eastern suits that stood out starkly against the more practical attire of the territorial court's usual attendees. Kade and Willow sat beside Hargrove at the plaintiff's table, presenting a united front as the judge entered and called the court to order. The proceedings were technical and, at times, tediously detailed, with both sides presenting arguments about survey lines, claim stakes, and mining regulations. As the San Francisco Company's lead attorney made his final statement, emphasizing the supposed errors in Elijah Warren's original claim, Kade reached under the table to squeeze Willow's hand. Her fingers tightened around his, betraying the tension she otherwise concealed behind a composed expression. When the judge finally rendered his decision, the relief was almost overwhelming. The court ruled in favor of the rattlesnake mine, finding that the original survey was valid and that the Warren claim to the eastern section was legally sound. Furthermore, the judge admonished the San Francisco Mining Company for what he termed vexatious litigation designed to harass a legitimate business operation. Outside the courthouse, standing in the bright Arizona sunshine, Willow finally allowed her composure to crack. Tears of relief and joy spilled down her cheeks as Kade pulled her into an embrace, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. "We did it," she said when he set her down, wiping at her eyes with uncharacteristic disregard for public displays of emotion. "The rattlesnake is safe." "You did it," Kade corrected, his hand still resting on her waist. "Your determination, your refusal to give up, that's what won the day." Hargrove approached them, smiling broadly. "Congratulations, Miss Warren, Mr. Calloway, a well-deserved victory. The San Francisco Company won't be able to challenge your claim again without substantial new evidence, which I doubt they can produce." "What will they do now?" Willow asked, her practical mind already turning to the future. "Most likely they'll look for easier targets," Hargrove said with a shrug. "Companies like that prefer to acquire operations without a fight if possible. You've proven the rattlesnake isn't worth the trouble." "Good," Willow said firmly. Now we can focus on reopening the eastern section and getting all our men back to work. The ride back to Naco was filled with plans and possibilities. With the legal challenge resolved, they could finally move forward with the expansion Willow had been planning before the cave-in. The eastern section of the mine, with its rich gold vein, could now be safely reopened. We should reach full production within 3 months, Willow calculated as they made camp that evening, preferring to sleep under the stars rather than in one of the crowded way stations along the route. And with the new processing method I've been researching, we could increase efficiency by at least 20%. Kade smiled as he built their campfire, listening to Willow outline her vision for the mine's future. Her enthusiasm was infectious, her mind always working several steps ahead. It was one of the many things he loved about her unwavering focus and determination. Loved. The word had crept into his thoughts more frequently in recent months, though he had yet to say it aloud. Their relationship had grown naturally, without the need for formal declarations. But as he watched her now, her face animated in the firelight as she described her plans, Kade knew it was time to put words to what he had been feeling. "Willow," he said when she paused for breath, "there's something I want to ask you." She looked up, alert to the change in his tone. "What is it?" Kade moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "This past year has been unlike anything I expected when I rode into Naco. I came looking for a business opportunity, maybe a place to settle temporarily. What I found was so much more." Willow's expression softened, her fingers tightening around his. "For me too," she said quietly. "After my father died, I thought the mine would be enough that I could pour myself into his legacy and be satisfied. But there was something missing, something I didn't even realize I wanted until you came along." Encouraged by her words, Kade continued. "I've spent most of my adult life moving from place to place, never putting down roots. After losing my family, I think I was afraid to care too deeply about anything or anyone. But you changed that, Willow. You made me want to stay, to build something permanent. And have you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Built something permanent?" "I hope so," Kade said, his eyes never leaving hers. "The ranch is doing well, my investment in the rattlesnake is paying off, and Naco feels more like home than anywhere has in years. But none of that would matter without you." Willow's breath caught, her brown eyes wide in the flickering firelight. "What are you saying, Kade?" Instead of answering immediately, Kade reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. He opened his palm to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a single diamond that caught the firelight and scattered it in tiny reflections. "I'm saying that I love you, Willow Warren, that I want to build a life with you not just as business partners, but as husband and wife, if you'll have me." For one of the few times since he had known her, Willow seemed at a loss for words. She stared at the ring, then at his face, her eyes filling with tears that spilled onto her cheeks. "I should warn you," she finally said, her voice unsteady but with a hint of her usual practicality, "that I'm not likely to become a conventional wife. I'll still want to run the mine, to make business decisions, to—" "I wouldn't want you any other way," Kade interrupted gently. "I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking if you'll share your life with me exactly as you are." Willow's face broke into a radiant smile then, and she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she said against his ear. "Yes, I'll marry you, Kade Calloway." Kade held her close, a profound sense of rightness settling over him. When they drew apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, just as he had hoped. "I had it made in Tucson last month," he admitted. "I've been carrying it around, waiting for the right moment." Willow examined the ring on her finger, her smile softening. "It's beautiful, simple but strong like us." They sealed their engagement with a kiss beneath the vast Arizona sky, the future stretching before them filled with promise despite the challenges they had faced, and those that likely still awaited them. News of their engagement spread quickly through Naco upon their return. Most of the town responded with delight and hearty congratulations. The miners who had worked for Willow's father and now for her were particularly pleased. They had watched with approval as Kade proved himself worthy of their respect through his dedication during the rescue and his subsequent support of the mine. George Pemberton, perhaps seeking to mend fences after the legal battle, was among the first to offer his congratulations. "Miss Warren Willow," he amended at her insistence, "I want you to know that despite our differences over the San Francisco company's offer, I have always held you in the highest regard. Your father would be proud of how you've managed the rattlesnake, and I believe he would approve of your choice in Mr. Calloway." Coming from the banker, this was high praise indeed, and Willow accepted it with grace. "Thank you, George. Your good opinion means a great deal to me." The wedding was set for early summer, a time when both the mine and Kade's ranch would be at their most stable, allowing them a brief honeymoon. In the meantime, there was much to be done reopening the eastern section of the mine, expanding Kade's cattle operation, and deciding where they would make their home. "Your house is more established," Kade pointed out as they discussed the matter one evening on Willow's porch. "And it's closer to the mine. But your ranch is where your future is," Willow countered. "And I don't mind the ride to the rattlesnake. Besides, once the eastern section is fully operational again, Hank can handle the day-to-day management. I won't need to be there from dawn until dusk as I have been." In the end, they decided on a compromise. They would live primarily at Kade's ranch, which he was already expanding with an eye toward their future together. But they would maintain Willow's house as well, using it when mine business required her to be closer to operations. As spring bloomed across the Arizona territory, bringing wildflowers to the desert and new calves to Kade's growing herd, the eastern section of the rattlesnake mine reopened with appropriate ceremony. The entire town turned out for the occasion, watching as Willow, with Kade at her side, cut the ribbon strung across the newly reinforced mine entrance. "To new beginnings," she declared, echoing the toast they had shared months earlier when Kade had first agreed to lease her land. "And to the men who make the rattlesnake what it is, not just a hole in the ground, but a community." The miners cheered, their faces reflecting the relief and optimism that came with returning to full employment. The cave-in that had nearly claimed Willow's life was now a memory, a pivotal moment that had ultimately strengthened, rather than destroyed, the rattlesnake's future. Later that night, as they walked along the creek that ran through Kade's soon-to-be their land, Willow paused to look up at the star-filled sky. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't been in Naco that day?" she asked. "If you hadn't stepped forward to organize the rescue?" Kade considered her question, his arm around her waist as they stood together in the moonlight. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've come to believe that some things are meant to be, regardless of the path that leads to them." Willow looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "That sounds almost like fate, Mr. Calloway. I wouldn't have taken you for a romantic." "You bring it out in me," he said with a smile, bending to kiss her lightly. "But in all seriousness, I think we would have found each other somehow, even if the circumstances had been different. Some connections are too important to leave to chance." "I hope you're right," Willow said, leaning into him, "because I can't imagine my life without you in it now." The words settled between them, a truth that neither had expected when fate or chance, or whatever name they chose to give it, had brought them together in the aftermath of disaster. Their wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect early summer day in the Arizona territory. The ceremony was held outdoors, in the shade of the cottonwood trees near the creek on Kade's ranch. Most of Naco turned out for the occasion, along with ranchers from neighboring properties, and even a few dignitaries from Tucson who had come to know Willow through her mining business. Hank Billings stood as Kade's best man, while Mrs. Figueroa, who had been as close to a mother as Willow had known since childhood, served as her matron of honor. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, with Kade and Willow exchanging vows they had written themselves. "I promise to stand beside you, not behind you or before you," Kade said, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "To support your dreams as you have supported mine, to be your partner in all things from this day forward." Willow's response was equally heartfelt. "I promise to face whatever comes with the same courage and determination we found together in the darkness. To build with you a life as rich and valuable as any gold vein. To love you, Kade Calloway, for all the days we are granted together." When they were pronounced husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests could likely be heard all the way to Naco. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire county. As the festivities continued around them, Kade led Willow away from the crowd to a quiet spot by the creek. The moonlight silvered the water and cast long shadows from the cottonwoods, creating a private sanctuary for them amidst the celebration. "Mrs. Calloway," Kade said, the new name still feeling novel on his tongue. "How does it feel?" Willow smiled up at him, her hands resting on his chest. "Wonderful. Though I hope you understand that at the mine I'll still be Willow Warren. It's how the men know me, how the business contacts recognize me." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Kade assured her. "You've built that name into something respected throughout the territory. Besides," he added with a grin, "I rather like the idea of being married to the formidable Willow Warren." "And I rather like being married to the man who dug for 48 hours straight to find me," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "My very own hero, whether you accept the title or not." "I'm no hero," Kade protested, as he always did when the subject arose. "Just a man who couldn't bear the thought of leaving someone in the dark." "And yet, you brought me into the light," Willow said softly, "in more ways than one." They stood together by the creek for a long while, content in each other's company as the sounds of celebration drifted to them on the evening breeze. Their journey had begun in crisis and darkness, but had led them here to a moment of perfect understanding and promise beneath an Arizona sky. In the years that followed, Kade and Willow built the life they had envisioned together. The Rattlesnake Mine flourished under their joint management, eventually becoming one of the most productive operations in the territory. Kade's cattle ranch expanded as well, with their combined business acumen leading to success that neither might have achieved alone. They faced challenges, of course, as all couples do, drought years that tested the ranch, fluctuating gold prices that affected the mine's profitability, and the occasional clash that arose from having two strong-willed individuals sharing a life and business interests. But through it all, the foundation they had established in those first desperate hours of the mine rescue held firm. 2 years after their wedding, Willow gave birth to their first child, a son they named Elijah, after her father. He was joined 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah, named for Kade's mother. The children grew up with the unique advantage of having both a successful mine and a thriving ranch as their playground and education, developing their mother's sharp intelligence and their father's quiet strength. Naco grew and changed as well, evolving from a rough mining town into a more established community. Willow and Kade were instrumental in this development, using their influence and resources to bring improvements like a proper school, a larger doctor's office, and eventually, when technology allowed, telephone lines connecting the town to Tucson and beyond. On the 10th anniversary of the cave-in, they held a special commemoration at the mine. The event honored both the successful rescue and the decade of prosperity that had followed. Many of the original miners who had worked alongside Kade to dig Willow out were still employed at the Rattlesnake, and they shared stories of those tense 48 hours with newer employees and the community at large. As the official ceremonies concluded, Kade and Willow slipped away from the crowd to visit the now sealed northern shaft where the collapse had occurred. A simple plaque marked the spot, acknowledging both the near tragedy and the determination that had prevented it from becoming something worse. 10 years, Willow mused, her hand in Kade's as they stood before the plaque. At 34, she was still as vibrant and determined as ever, though responsibility and motherhood had added a new depth to her character. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and other times it seems like another lifetime. In many ways, it was another lifetime, Kade replied. At 38, his sandy hair was touched with the first hints of gray at the temples, but his strength and steady nature remained unchanged. For both of us. Willow nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "I've been thinking about something lately," she said after a moment. "About how often the most important turning points in our lives look like disasters when we're going through them. Like being buried in a mine collapse," Kade asked with a smile. "Exactly like that," Willow agreed. "If you had told me then that the cave-in would lead to everything we have now, our marriage, our children, the success of the Rattlesnake, everything, I wouldn't have believed it possible." "Life has a way of surprising us," Kade said, drawing her closer. "Especially when we're open to possibilities we hadn't considered before. Like falling in love with the cowboy who dug you out of a collapsed mine," Willow teased, though her eyes were serious. "Precisely," Kade said, bending to kiss her lightly. "Though I maintain that anyone would have done what I did." "But it wasn't anyone," Willow pointed out, as she had countless times over the years. "It was you, and I thank God for that every day." They stood together a moment longer before turning to rejoin the celebration. Behind them, the sealed shaft stood as a monument to what might have been a tragedy, but had instead become the beginning of a love story that had reshaped not only their own lives, but the future of Naco itself. As they walked away, Kade's arm around Willow's waist and her head resting against his shoulder, they were not just a successful mine owner and rancher, not just business partners or even husband and wife. They were living proof that sometimes, out of the darkest moments can come the brightest futures if only there is someone willing to dig through the darkness to find the light.